Welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. I'm really enjoying my research and study into James Dunn's materials on the New Testament. He is truly considered one of the finest New Testament scholars, and for good reason. Number one, he's written an enormous amount, which is nice. Gives me lots to read and think about. His approach to the New Testament is one of the most refreshing approaches I found in a very long time. He's not too dogmatic. He insists on letting the evidence speak for itself as much as possible, and he shows a new interesting dimension that has arisen in New Testament studies due to the nature of not only some current findings in the scholarly reassessment of the relationship with Christianity and the other various groups. It's impossible, with the information that we've been discovering in the history of earliest Christianity, it's officially impossible at this point to declare there was an original Christianity in the singular. There were many, many different groups in the cross-current of early Jewish Christian Christianity. There were Gnostics, there were Judaizers, there were Essenes, there were Zealots. It's incredibly interesting how the various groups have come to the fore in discussing the meaning of much of the New Testament, and how the New Testament doctrines have developed through time as evidenced in the New Testament, the various interpretations that the writers of the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the letters of Peter and Jude and John have demonstrated. There is a unity, a substratum, that all of the various different groups more or less agreed upon, but there is a huge amount of diversity of interpretation about what that unity meant for them. It made a difference whose audience the author was addressing. He did not address the same group if they were Jewish as another author addressed the concerns, the teachings, the doctrines of Jesus, the acts of Jesus, the words of Jesus, if the audience was a Gentile mix or some other. So it's a real interesting idea to see the various interpretations in the New Testament and how James Dunn describes these. He says, I'm going to skip that part. I'm going to hop, skip, and jump because it's a 500-page book. There's no way I can read all of this to you and get away with that and put you to sleep. You notice in his introduction to the third edition, to the foreword, he said, "It has struck me with increasing force over the past decade or two that Paul's image of the church as the body of Christ reinforces many of the lessons to be drawn from the New Testament's unity and its diversity. For as was well appreciated by the political philosophers of Paul's time, to whom Paul was no doubt in at least some degree indebted for this image of the community as a body, the body is a unique kind of unity." That is, a unity that consists of and is possible only because the members of the body are all different and all of them have different functions. And this is one of the analogies of Paul. That is, a unity that is not a unity of sameness, not a unity threatened by difference, but a unity that can only function by such, as such, by reason of those differences. A unity that involves recognition of and a living out of mutual interdependence by each on the other. A unity that can only thrive by integrated and coordinated diversity. The hand cannot say to the foot, "I have no need of thee." The nose doesn't tell the eyes and the ears, "I have no need of thee. You can't smell, therefore I am the only true organ of the body." The brain can't say to the knee, I have no need of thee, etc., etc. The elbow can't tell the knee, I have no need of thee. Every different organ, every different joint, every different limb and part of the body has its specific function that is different, but when they coordinate together, it forms an absolutely magnificent piece of art, which Paul actually called the temple of God. It is a beautiful illustration of the unity within diversity of the body of Christ, from Paul's analogy. Well, that has implications for an individual congregation, as 1 Corinthians 12 makes plain, for the functioning together of several churches in any one place, as Romans 12 implies, and for the church universal, as Ephesians 1 and 4 suggest. In other words, for all of the various Christian churches out there, Paul's image of the body is the image that he wanted to express to the entire concept called Christianity. The unifying bond of the body of Christianity, of confessing Jesus as Lord, or equivalent, should be sufficient to hold together the diversity of elaborated confessions within Christianity, sufficient for the diversity to work together for the common commitment of serving the Lord. To require assent to more elaborate confessions or to a particular halakhic or traditional practices is to side with the Pharisees who criticized Jesus for eating with sinners in Mark 2:16 following, or to side with the Peter whom Paul condemned for not walking straight towards the truth of the gospel in Galatians 2:14. We dishonor the unique centrality of Christ when we demand a larger unity and refuse to acknowledge the diversity through which the commitment to Christ can be expressed. The Mormons we have our own interpretation and views and ways of worshiping Jesus. As the Baptists are different than us, the Roman Catholics are different than all of us, so are the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, even the non-denominational Christians nowadays. There is a diversity of expression of worship of the Lord. The other line of recollection worth pursuing is the hermeneutical implications of the same unity and diversity theme. In 1997, I did not endeavor to develop the obvious point that the one text gives rise to diverse interpretations, beyond the brief discussion of a canon within a canon. That would have added a further dimension to the study that might have detracted from its principal focus, which was to draw attention to the diversity which is not simply a matter of diverse readings of individual texts. In other words, there is a diversity within Christianity. Each different group of Christians interpret the Bible differently than the others. And that is an actual diversity. But there's even a better, bigger, larger, more interesting diversity right within Christianity. The body of Christianity. The finding of a genuinely bonding and integrating unity within and through the diversity is closely analogous to the hermeneutical assertion of a unifying subject matter. That would be Jesus is the unifying subject matter of all Christianity at this point, within and through the diversity of the way Jesus is explained and understood by the various different churches. As soon as the actual reading or hearing of a text is seen to be integral to the meaning which in the event is read or heard from that text, it becomes impossible to speak of an unequivocal or narrow single meaning for that text. One text can have various meanings. Depends on the group it's being addressed to. It depends on the time in the place of history. It depends where. It's all about context, isn't it? When you stop and think about that, that makes beautiful sense, doesn't it? I really love how he words this. Yet it does not follow that the meaning of the text becomes uncontrollably diverse. No, of course not. For the text itself remains the same. The text itself is the unifying element within the diversity of the interpretations of that text. Well, this point became clearer to me in my studies of the Jesus tradition as oral tradition. For a lesson I learned from a discussion of oral culture is that one cannot speak of an original version of a story, but only of multiform versions. And yet typically the substance of the story remains the same. So with the Jesus tradition as we see it in the Synoptics. We can speak of a single originating impulse, that is, the teachings, the actions of Jesus, is the impulse within the Synoptics, but not of an original version, for Jesus may have given the same teaching in substance on several different occasions and in different words with different illustrations. And his actions and words, no doubt, would have had a slightly different impact on different disciples, so that not every disciple remembers the same thing about what Jesus said and did. They have a diversity of interpreting Jesus, but the unifying factor is Jesus. From the beginning, there was no single original version in an oral tradition from which all other versions were derived. That's not how oral tradition works. Now, a literary tradition does work that way, but in Jesus' day, it wasn't a literary tradition that originated about Jesus. It was an oral tradition, and this oral tradition, some scholars say, lasted for several hundred years. In fact, it lasted side by side with the written Gospels as they were written down and began to be written down. Mark is suggested to be the first, based on internal and linguistic factors, based on the external history that we understand about that era. And then Matthew and Luke, aside from using materials in Mark, had other sources, the one source they call the Q source. And John, of course, is vastly different from the three synoptics. There isn't an original version that is authentic in the telling of the Jesus tradition. And that is interesting to understand. The assumption that there must be a single original version of each teaching orally given, and each event to recover, which therefore becomes the goal of historical Jesus research, is simply false. The unifying factor remains Jesus, to be sure. Jesus himself, but the impact he made was diverse, and that's evident still in the variations of the synoptic tradition. Each one of the authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, did not record the same information about Jesus, either what he said, where he was, when he was where he was, what he did, how people responded to him, etc. Each one of the three synoptics has their diverse interpretation of Jesus, because they passed it on orally first, and through the time, then when the evangelists decided, whoever they were, to begin to write it down, they assembled their materials, just like Luke says, and tried to recall, as accurately as they could, what Jesus had done, said, thought, etc. An important corollary to this insight is that differences and divergences in the synoptic tradition do not mean that one of the Gospels, say either Matthew or Mark or Luke, is correct while the other ones are wrong. That's not what that means in an oral tradition, in a society that is based on an oral culture. That might apply if there was a single original version in each case, but there's not. But it's not a case of finding the original actual correct one and the other ones being incorrect, not in an oral tradition. The diversity is actually part of the oral tradition from the very beginning. Now, the unity of the impact that was made by Jesus, of course, is recognized by all of the Gospels and all the letters of Paul, as far as that goes. However, the diversity is an important aspect of the authenticity of the tradition, because Jesus wouldn't have taught the same ideas the same throughout the course of his 3 or 4 year mission as he traveled around and taught the people. He would have taught each different group a little bit differently in different words, maybe using different illustrations. So that there wasn't an original oral tradition. There were many of them that were circulating around the various communities and area around Palestine and Jerusalem, and these began to be gathered and were written down eventually. That's how the oral tradition aspect works with the background. Matthew, for instance, gives a conservative hearing or reading an interpretation of Jesus on the Torah is as valid and authentic as Mark's more radical interpretation of Jesus' view on the Torah. But Matthew interprets Jesus' view on the Torah differently than how Mark presents Jesus' view on Torah. That doesn't mean one or the other of them is wrong. That just means they understand it differently. Their interpretation is based on the various audiences they give their information to. The fact that the gospel was heard and its corollaries drawn out in both more conservative and more radical terms, as Galatians 2 implies, and yet was the gospel, that shouldn't surprise us at all. There was numerous ways of presenting the gospel as the people remembered them. The unifying element of Jesus himself is not reducible to a precise formula. So the gospel is not reducible to some final formulation of universal application, and so too theology, that is, words that attempt to speak about God, is not reducible to any finally and solely authoritative formula. The word within the word ever escapes our comprehension. It grasps us, but we can never grasp it. Paul is strictly correct when he says, we see through a glass darkly. He's quite serious about that. So this is very interesting. Instead of worrying about finally pinning down and determining the unity and controlling what that unity is, Dunn demonstrates how the various New Testament authors through time has had a huge, diverse way of interpreting Jesus in all of his phases. And it is a remarkable thing that there was no dogma, there was no technical orthodoxy in the various earliest stratum of Christianity, which technically is a wrong thing to call it, because there was no Christianity in Jesus' day. We have to begin taking seriously the fact that Jesus was an absolute strict law-abiding Jew. I mean, he kept the law of Moses throughout his life. He did not come to get rid of it. That was Paul's interpretation. You see, the interpretation is different in the Synoptic Gospels. And the way Dunn handles this is extremely interesting. It's quite fun. So I'm going to explore quite a few of Dunn's contributions to this very interesting way of looking at the Scriptures and at earliest Christianity through numerous of his writings. He is such a good New Testament author. I've determined I'm going to buy every book he's ever written and read every book. Right now, this is the one. This one and a couple of others are really exercising me right now, which is a good thing because I like to use my brain. I like to think through things and learn historical insights that I can't get in any other way than through studying the scholars, because, of course, they have a unique way of, they have unique tools that they can use of getting to the historical situation that the churches just simply can't. They have the mannerisms, the style of tools, the language basis, the various scholarly applications to what we know is historical criticism. There are certain methodologies that are correct, and there are certain methodologies that are incorrect. So as an historical study, this is extremely interesting to notice how much unity there really is in this New Testament we have, and yet how diverse the various interpretations are. And he demonstrates this throughout the Synoptics in relation to John as a gospel, the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, the letters of John. It is an exquisite study, so I'm looking forward to sharing many ideas with you on this. So thanks for watching my videos, and I will see you in the next video.